Today we are going to discuss on the question of violence as Hannah Arendt has discussed in her book On Violence, published in 1970. I begin with the famous words of Arendt to give a perspective of what we are going to look at. In her own words, she says, I quote her, "The end of human action as distinct from the end products of fabrication can never be really predicted. The means used to achieve political goals are more often than not of greater relevance to the future world than the intended goals." In simple terms, we all have certain goals and a political society has goals. So the goals is the end result that we are looking forward to. But we can never predict what that end result would be. We have something in mind, we want that to happen, but it's never in our hands. But what is in our hands is the means that we use. The choice of the means is very important because that we know how we are going to achieve the end goal. Therefore, what is to be paid more attention is to look at the means themselves because they have greater relevance to the future world. Now, Hannah Arendt says this in a context where there is so much of use of violence as part of creating or constructing or arriving at the end goals that the political society wants to get it. So therefore it is in the situation where she makes this reflection of the state of political society, and then she brings our attention to the misnomer or the confusion that people may have in their minds about the use of certain terminology, especially when it comes to political thinking. She tries to explain some of the key terms and then distinguishes one from another. And she thinks these terms are oftentimes interchangeably used. Power, strength, force, authority, and finally violence. These terms are interchangeably used in political discourses. Hannah Arendt wants to draw our attention to the distinctions that exist among these terms because this clarity will help us to understand power, at the same time violence. So our focus is obviously the means here, the violence, but the question of power is equally important because she tries to contrast violence with power. Now she begins to clarify the idea of power. Power is basically our human ability not only to act, but to act in coordination. What does that mean? Power is never a property of the individual. Actually, power belongs to the group. And it can be existing only as long as the group remains together. If the group becomes divisive along any lines, whether it is in terms of like a racial discrimination or a class division, or any division, then power ceases to exist because power is precisely the ability of humans to act, but this action happens in terms of the coordination that we have. Otherwise, it becomes problematic. Now, I think that clarifies our understanding of power. So we can notice immediately that there is a vast difference between her understanding of power and the common way in which we make use of the term power. Hannah Arendt also clarifies the meaning of other terms, among which strength, force, and authority are also part. Strength is something that belongs to the individual, singular individual. So it is not the same as the power. Power is something that belongs to the group, whereas strength is what I have. So that is why we often speak about the strength that I have. It may not be only the physical strength, but it could also be my emotional strength, my mental strength, all that as an individual that I am capable of having in a given situation. Hannah Arendt again speaks about force. Force is something like an energy that we can see unfolding in physical movement or social movement. It can also be seen as part of the natural world. So we do speak about the force of nature, the energy that is part of the physical universe. But it also could be the force of the social movements, the force of certain circumstances, the force of certain events. Here, of course, we talk about the social events or the social circumstances. Authority is another term that she distinguishes from power, strength, and force, and also violence. Authority is one of the concepts that is used mostly by social scientists, and this is something that is vested in the individuals, in individual persons. We also have different kinds of authority. The authority is not univocal. We speak about the personal authority. The personal authority is something that we have in a relation between the parent and the child, for example. We also have authority that is invested by virtue of the office that you hold. So if you hold a position that you have an authority, the mayor, for example, of the corporation has an authority because of the position that person holds. It may not be only a political society, it can be in any society for that matter. So there is a recognition here of some people who are vested with authority for the sake of the better functioning of the society here. So therefore, we don't try to challenge that, which is something that we take as part of our social living. And so also we don't challenge the personal authority. A child child does not challenge the authority of the parents, for example, in the normal circumstances. Now let us come to the most important concept here, which is violence. Violence, according to her, can always destroy power. Now, you can immediately notice that there is a head-on clash, in her own words, between violence and power. Now, why this clash between violence and power? Because violence and the threat of violence does not enhance the power, it diminishes the power, according to her. Especially those who are in authority. When they take recourse to violence, she gives an example from the history. For example, the emperors, the famous notorious people rather, Caligula, the Roman emperor, or Nero for that matter, where in their hands, when violence becomes a tool, a means, it only diminishes their power. And that is the reason violence destroys power. It is not capable of creating power. So, when Arendt is writing, she is critical of all those people who are advocating violence. And she is very sympathetic towards non-violent movements. So, that is how she tries to analyze the question of violence. Though, of course, she is not dismissing all kinds of violence, but generally she is criticizing violence, and that is how she tries to analyze whether it is a Marxist understanding or the existentialist understanding. Now, in the beginning, as I told you, one of the reasons I chose this theme is because of the the issue that went viral with regard to George Lloyd. But also we have in India many such incidents these days are reported. The question of violence that is being used, unleashed on sometimes common innocent people. So there was a report that went viral in the national media, even international media, about the custodial death of two persons, the father and the son, in the police custody in the state of Tamil Nadu. And then following that, so many videos came how in the lockdown period, for little violation of rules, how people are brutally attacked, and all those videos were circulated. Now, this context of ours is not very dissimilar to the context of Arendt herself. Because Arendt, when she wrote this book, she was responding to the violence as it unfolded before her eyes in various situations. Some of them are of global importance, like the violence of the Second World War, or the violence in the Vietnam War. But also the student riots in Paris in 1968. Yes, you want to say something?
Is it okay if I have a question? Is it alright if I interrupt you, or should I just use the raise my hand icon?
Mahika, you could note down your question. We'll come back and take it up after my presentation is over, as I don't want the recording to be interrupted.
Alright.
Thank you. So what I was trying to tell you is, the different forms of violence, some of them of global importance, some of them of importance of a specific continent. Now, the Second World War, the violence that we know was something that affected everybody, and so also the war in Vietnam, to the great extent it had an impact globally. But we also had the students' riot in Paris, the famous May 1968 events. But also the People's Park protests in Berkeley, and this is what triggered her off actually, because she was at that time exactly in Berkeley. And she was teaching to the students, and those students were involved in this People's Park protest in Berkeley, and how they were targeted, they were brutally attacked by the police in Berkeley. So, creating so much of disturbance, not only disturbance, it even they were brutally violent, and it disturbed even their buildings, and I think people were injured, though nobody died. So that was known as a Bloody Thursday, that particular incident. It happened on a Thursday on May 15, 1969. Now, this is where Hannah Arendt begins to reflect about this question of violence. And then her famous affirmation is that government agents don't think clearly. Now she tries to explain that, what she means by they don't think clearly. She clarifies by saying it is not that they are cold-blooded enough to think the unthinkable, but they just do not think. It is not that they are evil people, they think something, very evil thoughts and so on. It's not that kind of thing. They are just thoughtless. Now, if you knew Arendt, this word thoughtless has a specific meaning. Now, she doesn't, in the normal word, when we say I am thoughtless of something, could imply many things, like I am little inconsiderate, or I forgot something, etc. Here it is not that. This is basically the thoughtlessness, or they don't think, would imply a certain naivety, a certain stupidity that we have. In other words, we don't make use of our brains. So when she says the government agents do not think clearly, they just fail to make use of their brains. They are so naive. And then she tries to explain this in terms of how they are looking at some goals without realizing that they don't have control over the goals. Now, in the case of the People's Park protest, the goal was to end the protest. Now, but instead of ending the protest, they made it worse by bringing in violence. So there is no way in which they thought clearly. Not because they are people with evil thoughts. I mean, she tries to come and build on this. One of the important claims of Hannah Arendt in another work is evil is banal. The famous work Eichmann in Jerusalem, when Eichmann was put on trial for the Nazi atrocities. She hoped to see some monstrous person there, but this was a normal person like anybody else. He was just thoughtless. That's all it meant. He did not think clearly. So that was her claim. So it is banal. It is in everyday life. Evil is in everyday life. Evil is not something extraordinary of the normal human being. So you and I, all of us are capable of that evil if we do not think. If we are stupid and naive, then we will end up doing evil. So our thoughtlessness can cost high. So this thoughtlessness is precisely because they have not realized that they do not have control over the end goal. They cannot predict it. You might desire it, but then that is why it is important. The means that you use should have been considered, should have been thought through, because that has a greater impact. Now, this is in this context she tries to problematize this question of violence, and then she explains how the non-violent ideas of Marx has often been misappropriated. She wants us to realize in the writings of Marx itself, Marx does not advocate violence. When Marx speaks about revolution, it is something that happens naturally. It doesn't happen by chance. It doesn't happen by some decision that you make that now I should, revolt. Now, when people have had enough of suffering and there is nothing more, then there naturally comes the question of revolt. But unfortunately, this has been wrongly interpreted according to her. Later, some people, as we know, the communist regimes resorted to violence. But originally, according to her, the revolutionary left, under the influence of Marx's teachings, ruled out the use of violent means. So this is a very important point that she is trying to make. So revolution is not something that is made intentionally or arbitrarily, but that emerged as a natural result of circumstances entirely independent of the will and the guidance of particular parties and whole class. In 1908 already, much before Hannah Arendt was on scene, which she makes reference to, the famous George Sorel wrote Reflections on Violence. There he combined Marxism with Bergson's philosophy of life. And he was trying to develop an idea of amalgamation between these two ideas, Marxism on the one hand and Bergson's philosophy of life. And therefore, the class struggle that he brought out by amalgamating these two different schools of thought is understood by George Sorel in military terms. Therefore, he ended up proposing the famous, myth of general strike, a form of action according to Arendt, which we think today belongs to the arsenal of non-violent politics. but this had a serious violent, series of violent actions. This is a whole general strike, and of course today again we know that every time when there's a general strike, it doesn't happen in a non-violent way. Oftentimes it is coupled with sometimes serious violence. Sartre also amalgamated Marxism with existentialism. And one of the criticisms that she makes against Sartre is Sartre advocated for violent protest. Sartre is very vocal about it. He wrote a preface, to one of the popular writings of Frantz Fanon. Fanon is one of the post-colonial thinkers from the French department called Martinique. It's one of the island regions of the Antilles. His famous book titled The Wretched of the Earth was published in 1963, and at the time of Arendt this book was very widely read. It was much discussed in the academic circles and so on. It's a nice piece of writing. If you guys have some time, you could always read that book. That also could bring in this notion of violence for us to problematize. Now, Marx was not probably aware of the fact that how he was promoting violence, but he did write it in the following words, that irrepressible violence is man recreating himself. See, in the preface, Sartre writes these words: irrepressible violence is man recreating himself. In other words, the wretched of the earth, if they want to become men, real human beings, the wretched of the earth are the ones who are, degraded, humiliated, and if they want to become, they are segregated. Of course, if they want to assert their dignity, if they want to be real human persons, vested with human rights and dignity, then it is only through violence that they could do that. It is their mad fury that will enable them to create themselves. So, what Marx does is by turning, what Sartre does is by turning Marxian idea to suit his existential thinking. In fact, Marx had already turned the ideas of Hegel, his idealism. He has turned it upside down, because Hegel said we produce ourselves through our thinking. It's a human thought that produces. Marx turned it down by saying, no, we produce ourselves through our labor, the human form of metabolism with nature. That is what fulfills this function of creating ourselves. Now, Sartre makes a shift from there, and it is a shift towards violence in terms of revolution. Sartre may have a logic, according to Arendt, of his own, but this was not, this particular logic was not within the thinking of Marx in any case. Obviously, Sartre, she tries to now analyze Sartre, and then she says, it is the experience of the war that Sartre had that must have given him this idea of the necessity of violence. Arendt thinks this has affected the successive generations, who, even though they did not have the experience of war as Sartre had a recourse to taking violence in their hands. So she calls this as a pathos of the new left. In her own words, she says this pathos is connected with the weird suicidal development of modern weapons. So one of the reasons why we, the modern generation is so much into weapons, not only in terms of protection but also in using them, is precisely this pathos that has led to this. So this generation, according to her, lives under the shadow of the atom bomb, the first reaction and the revulsion against every form of violence. Now, she further tries to say that things have changed ever since. The adherents of non-violence now are on the defensive. So only the extremists who promote violence, they glorify violence, and they are on the rise. And they have discovered only violence pays. So if you want to get something done, it's only by violence. So this seems to be a very unfortunate scenario. And she is in fact lamenting this. So she quotes George Wald. According to him, what we are up against is a generation that is by no means sure that it has a future. To the often heard question, who are they, this new generation, one is tempted to answer, those who hear the ticking. Now, so there is a whole question of, Arendt is trying to situate this whole question of violence, how the Sartrean amalgamation of existentialism, that is due to this experience with war, coupled with Marxism, Marxist understanding of revolution, has led to this weak patronizing nuclear weapons. And she also says this has a deep violence for the nature, because there is whole question of climate change, and this is going to affect a generation to come. So she also pays attention to the question of the student rebellion, which has become a global phenomenon. So we already know the famous student riots in Paris in 1968. This has kind of became a widespread phenomenon, not only within Europe, but also in the United States. And the student movement, particularly in the United States, has become radicalized. And when the student movement becomes seriously radicalized, and the reason for it is, when the students are, she's not blaming the students here, that is precisely because of the brutal interventions of the police. Because students' movements are essentially, at least in principle, or originally, they were non-violent demonstrations. But then the intolerance towards the non-violent demonstrations has made the state machinery get panic, and then the employment of the police, which manifests itself in brutal violence, has radicalized the student movements. She also speaks about another phenomenon that is discussed by Martin Seligman in his overview of university psychology departments. So it is they both complain of universities admitting black students without any academic qualifications, who are ill-equipped to do the work. For a brief time, while the most prestigious schools typically admitted 25% of people who applied in the late 16s, they began to admit 75% of people who applied and also identified as having black heritage. Arendt explained this phenomenon, I quote her, "The yielding of university authorities to black demands has often been explained by the guilt feelings of the white community." So probably we have not heard of this kind of understanding of diversity policy in the United States. There's a different kind of understanding. We may not agree with this to some extent, or we may like to discuss this, but it is basically the guilt feelings. It is not because of any other reason. Now, whether we could accept this as a kind of slight racist approach, I mean, it's for us to think. Obviously, in the case of Seligman, one would say that it has a racist overtone, surely. Whether that could be attributed to Arendt is not a very clear understanding. Whether she is simply reiterating what Seligman says, it's not a very tasteful idea in any case. even if she were to reiterate that. But definitely there is something that we could discuss, we could look into in a more detailed way. Now coming back to the Marx ideas, the new undeniable glorification of violence by the student movement has a curious peculiarity. The rhetoric of the new militants probably is inspired by Fanon, but their theoretical arguments contain usually nothing but all kinds of the remnants of Marxism. So Sartre has given, for example, given expression to violence. He believes that on the strength of Fanon's book, the what can heal the wound is by using the weapon that has created the wound. So it looks like the revenge seems to be the cure for most of our problems. To be fair to Fanon, probably Fanon, being black and has suffered the violence of racism and discrimination, wrote in a provocative manner. But whether he was really advocating the dream of violence is not very easy to say. But this is not, as she said, what really Marx held. For Marx, the rarity of slave rebellions and of uprisings among the disinherited and the downtrodden is notorious. This is words of Arendt herself. Now, Arendt speaks about, explains that there is a problem again when it comes to the third world. Particularly when we want to look at the scenario of the third world in terms of the liberation movements and things like that. That is because she says the third world is not a reality. It is merely an ideology. It is not a reality, but merely an ideology. Now, her position that the downtrodden rarely successfully rise up against the oppressors is something again we can critically look at. There are historical examples, where the colonized people did successfully rise against their oppressors. So whether we need to take her seriously on that point, from the point of view of political thinking, is something we have to critically appropriate. Arendt really laments the change that took over left-wing politics, which she thinks lost touch with the working class, and the left, the new left as she calls that, is swept by certain bureaucracy. Now note, Arendt is not speaking against the left intellectual thinking, particularly as is given to us by Marxian understanding or Marx's understanding of revolution. But what has now happened, the new left has remained in what she calls a declamatory stage. So it becomes a huge party mission, and it only represents its own functionaries, not even those who are part of that affiliation. So not even the people who are affiliated with that, but only their own functionaries. So it is always one party functionary versus other party functionary. So there is a whole kind of change in the question of rebellion and this has become a challenge for the moral character. So it is no longer, the rebellion is not towards the oppressors, but a kind of infight that emerges between the functionaries. So Arendt says an important point which is worth noting. Every revolutionary movement has been led by the disinterested who were motivated by compassion or by a passion for justice. Now, the revolutionary movement, to begin with, obviously is led by those who are not concerned about themselves. And they had a compassion for people, and they had passion for justice. But this is not exactly what gets translated into when it gets into your party mission. So they became very interested about their own power. Here, of course, the power has to be understood not in terms of Arendt understanding of power as a group activity, that's an activity done in coordination, but about their own vested interest to exert individual power on others. Hannah Arendt also speaks about progress in this little work on violence. And we normally think of progress in terms of acquiring knowledge and character rather than land and possessions. But the development of capitalism and the constant growth of capitalism force us to constantly compare our lot with others. And therefore, there is no longer the question of being more but having more. We try to strive for having more. And obviously, we try to see each other as competitors. So this progress is not a real progress in that sense. So the notion that there is such a thing as progress of mankind as a whole was unknown prior to the 17th century. Because the 17th century, in fact, thought of progress in terms of accumulation of knowledge through the centuries. So the 18th century, we have this, for the 18th century, the word implied, the progress implied basically education of humanity. So therefore, that would lead to human being coming of age. Coming of age would mean human being would be able to think for themselves independently, not to be taking subserviently what is being handed down to them by others. So this whole education of humanity is meant for them. Now, but that is not the case anymore. So we have, human development has now become a form of chronological unfairness. Because centuries after century, progress is now becoming very troublesome. Troublesome because it is not any longer about building your rationality, your thinking, and your character. It is all about grabbing and accessing and having more. And this has kind of led to irrational faith of liberals in growth. So characteristic of our present political and economic theories. Now, if you notice very clearly, we do see that one of the reasons it tries to trace back violence is also partly because of the shift in the understanding of progress. I am purposely highlighting only the few of the points that we might resonate in our own context today. When I began presenting Arendt, I began saying that the context is not very dissimilar. In fact, it is quite similar to the situation where we live. And Arendt wrote probably about 50 years ago, half a century ago. So this is, so there has been so much of manipulation that happens in this generation according to her. So men can be manipulated now because of this greed that we have. People are manipulated, and this violence becomes a tool of manipulation. Now note, violence is not only by using weapons. Violence can be even in terms of starvation. So these are kind of, ways which people are led to starve so that they can be manipulated. So she uses the word addicts who think everyone is and can be manipulated into action. Well, this is something that we do witness around us in different ways, I quote here, progress is a more serious and a more complex item offered at the superstition fair of our time. These are her own words. Progress is a more serious and a more complex item offered at the superstition fair of our time. The irrational 19th century belief in the unlimited progress has found universal acceptance chiefly because of the astounding development of the natural sciences. That's one of the science and technology has brought this idea of progress, one of the catchword of 19th century or even in 20th century, even in the 21st century where we live, progress or development, whatever you may call that. The word may not necessarily mean the same. So there is the ceaseless, senseless demand for original scholarship in a number of fields where only erudition is now possible has led either to sheer irrelevancy or to the development of pseudo-scholarship. Now, she is purposely bringing in this idea of scholarship. If there is no real scholarship, then you cannot consider that as a progress. A true society which progresses is the one that has emboldened or empowered the true scholars. The true scholars are the ones who are, the original scholars are the ones who are able to independently think. They are not being coerced. They are not used as a propaganda for a certain ideology of power, of people holding power positions. So that is the reason this whole question of original scholarship she is bringing into in her understanding of violence. So if in a society violence abounds, it's a sign that original scholarship is dead. So there is a correlation between the death of original scholarship or the demise of original scholarship with the rise of violence. Now, as I explained to you earlier, the problem with some of the confusion that we have around violence is because of the imprecise use of the terms. Generally, she thinks people have a consensus, whether they are leftist or rightist, that violence is nothing more than the most flagrant manifestation of power. Now, this is a general kind of understanding. So, for example, Max Weber talks about the state as a rule of men over men based on the means of legitimate, that is, allegedly legitimate violence. So, you see, Max Weber sees power as related to violence. So, it has a legitimation. Or Wright Mill says all politics is a struggle for power. The ultimate kind of power is violence. This is how generally it is thought of. But she also points out there are differences. There are some other who don't see it in the same way. For example, Bertrand de Juvenal, to him who contemplates the unfolding of the ages, war presents itself as an activity of states which pertains to the essence. This may prompt us to ask whether the end of warfare would mean the end of states. A man feels himself more of a man when he is imposing himself and making others the instruments of his will. If power is about commanding, then the greatest power is from the barrel of gun. But it would be difficult to say in which way the order given by the policeman is a different form than what is given by a gunman. So the idea of power is about control and command, particularly if today you can consider power in terms of the large power invested in bureaucracy. Now, this is how generally the power is understood. So, but this is not what originally the understanding of power was. Whether it is in the understanding of the ancient Greeks or in the successive philosophies inspired by the ancient Greeks, the power is always understood in terms of something that, at least for her, it's something that is associated with the group activity, so that the group can be together, not divided. So for her to use power and violence as synonymous resulted in a kind of blindness to the realities they correspond to. It leads us to think the most important issue is who rules over whom. But it is only after one ceases to reduce public affairs to the business of dominion that the original data in the realm of human affairs will appear in their authentic diversity. These are her own words. Now, I'm not going to look at the successive pages where she discusses the distinctions, which I already have evoked. But let me come towards the end of her argument, where she disagrees with the opinion that evil is nothing but a temporary manifestation of a still hidden good. Now, she thinks this is a dangerous idea. She is discussing about this idea of evil in relation to violence. Now, violence can be seen to be evil, but there is something still good that is hidden behind it, because this is a dangerous idea. This idea is shared only for the simple reason that they inspire hope and dispel fear. A treacherous hope used to dispel legitimate fear. Violence cannot be derived from power. Violence is exactly the opposite of power. So if you want to understand violence, we have to look at its roots. So now, according to her, if you think it is natural to be violent, it doesn't give it any legitimacy. So, some people tend to say that it is only natural that we are violent. So it doesn't give any legitimacy to this violence. So for her, people and animals can be aggressive independent of provocation. Lack of provocation apparently leads to instinct frustration to repressed aggressiveness. So there is no way in which you could legitimize violence, because something is natural does not necessarily mean that is what you ought to be. So legitimization is always about what we ought to be, not necessarily what we are as we are. So let me come towards the end of her writing, where she is trying to sum up her ideas by criticizing the bureaucratization of government, where she tries to end like this: we do not know where these developments will lead us, but we know, or should know, that every decrease in power is an open invitation to violence. If only because those who hold power and feel it slipping from their hand, be they the government or be they the governed, have always found it difficult to resist the temptation to substitute violence for it. So this is the most important take-home point. So it is only when, whether the government or the people who are governed, it can be either way, only when the power is slipping from our hand, we are tempted to substitute violence for it. There would be a difference between the government and the governed, obviously. the power of the government is precisely to is something that is given by the people so that they can hold the people together. But if it is divisive, if they are entering into violent means and dividing the people, obviously the power is slipping away from them. So there is no way in which they can no longer hold on to the power, so they are substituting with violence. And people's resistance can also be seen from their point of view. Their own power is, they are deprived of their power, and therefore they are trying to substitute violence for it. So when this does not mean that we should honor power in order to avoid violence, but that we have to be prepared to cope with violence whenever power structures are challenged. So this is the reality. So whenever power structures are challenged, when she says power structures, it doesn't mean the bureaucratic structures, by the way. The fact that the power has in an inbuilt ability to hold people together, whenever that is challenged, violence is inevitable, seems to be, and therefore we need to learn to cope with violence. So I end my presentation on Hannah Arendt's book on violence. I have not exhausted the ideas. I have thrown some ideas that we will take up our discussion right now. Thank you.